troubling words. When we left Exodus last week, we watched as Pharaoh, this newbie king who did not know and remember Joseph. We watched him move from uncertainty to fear, from fear to deep prejudice, and then from prejudice to a public policy that will weave his bias into the very fabric of Egyptian society, and it will tear Egypt apart. And now, to advance his agenda, he stirs the pot even more with fear-mongering. Who are these people? These Hebrews, there are so many of them. They could turn on us, he fears. And in response, he made their lives very bitter. Ironically, we are told in those other verses that it was the Egyptians who resorted to violence and then end up turning the Israelites into slaves. This first chapter paints a grim picture, and it is not finished. Pharaoh's anxiety about these Hebrew people has now reached a fever pitch, and he formulates a plan, an evil plan. More than slavery, it's more than oppression. He makes an exceptionally cruel plan. Summoning 2 Hebrew midwives to him, he tells them that if a girl is born to the Hebrew people, let it live. But if it's a boy, kill it. And there you have it. 16 verses into the first chapter of Exodus, and the ruler of Egypt has declared genocide. The plot of Exodus wastes no time in plunging all of us into a moral abyss. Why so fast, you might answer? Can a society really lose its bearings that quickly? Scripture nods to us because the Bible harbors no illusions about our human capacity for evil, and neither should we. For modern society has far too many parallels, far too many equivalents. Think Stalin and Hitler and Mussolini and Pol Pot. Ancient Egypt has too many parallels as well. Think Darfur and Syria and Myanmar. We are not off the hook here either. For we need only remember what we waged against our Native American people, nor should we forget slavery. In these events, history's most oppressive chapters follow a grim pattern. It's an evil playbook. This script, written by Egypt's ruler and followed by some of history's worst, most corrupt and evil leaders, follows a terrible but same arch. It begins with this: scapegoating. Blaming some minority for its troubles, and then when fear and anger has peaked, it proposes a violent solution. And Exodus tracks this chilling progression. Today, we read about 2 enslaved women, and they are beckoned to Egypt's throne room, and standing before the Pharaoh, this man who wields supreme power, really more than a king. Ancient Egyptians, you see, thought their Pharaoh was a divine being. He was an earthly manifestation of a god. This ancient bully, decked out in gold, you can imagine, is peering down before these 2 women, and he demands that they kill Hebrew baby boys after they had assisted in their births. The king doesn't need to say, or else. They don't have a choice. They have no power. We can all feel powerless. This seems to be a recurring theme in these days of deep uncertainty on so many levels. We are all looking for that magical wand that we can just throw about and everything will get better, bring about change. In the face of this attitude, and to our complaints about insisting we have no power, that we can do nothing, that we are powerless, that we have no ability to make any change at all, this ancient text seems to be rolling its eyes at us and saying, stop. Exodus has no patience for those of us who are waiting around for others to make change happen. Really? Exodus saying to us, you have no power? And Exodus calls us into the throne room and invites us to peer through the glass, and there we see this ruthless leader and 2 seemingly powerless women, midwives. And Exodus bids us to look closer. What do you see? And then, as those 2 midwives get clearer into our focus, Exodus seems to be whispering to us, God's power is not like the Pharaoh's power. Oftentimes, God's power doesn't look anything like power at all. It's important to note here that this Pharaoh, this king, is never named. But these 2 midwives, these 2 nobodies, they have names. These beaten down slave women have names. Shipra and Puah. And their names mean little flower and lovely, which makes what happens next all the more ironic. This all-powerful Pharaoh king who wields power and has statues carved in his honor developed his killing field scheme out of fear of losing power, and to do this, he calls forth lovely and little flower to enforce his law for him. But instead, little flower and lovely defy his orders, and then when they are brought back to face the king, they boldly lie to his face. And these cool as a cucumber midwives, you can kind of see them smiling. And they flatter the Pharaoh, and they use Pharaoh's own prejudices against him. It's a hard thing, you've asked. You said it yourself. These Hebrew midwives, these Hebrew women, they are not like the delicate Egyptian women. They are tough as nails. They drop their babies and they are back in the fields before we can even get there. It's easy to be in awe of little Flower and Lovely. They're like those little, or those big, I shouldn't say little, judo wrestlers. They let Pharaoh charge forward, clinging to his prejudice, and then that leaves him unbalanced, and then the next thing you know, they assist him in stumbling toward a silly conclusion. They smile and calmly tell this tyrant, insist that he's issued an impossible decree for them. You are right, they say to the king. These Hebrews are just too darn tough. We can't carry out your order. Shipra and Puah are champions. They are protectors. They refuse to do the bidding of injustice and death and evil, but rather calmly and with great courage and a lot of grit, they choose God's way of justice, and they keep on delivering life. And they call us to do the same when we think we have no choices, no alternatives. Yes, you do, Exodus insists, because justice and life, that is the way of God. But of course, Pharaoh wasn't satisfied. For as our text tells us, he then insists that all Egyptians join in this plan, and they kill any Hebrew baby boy and throw it into the Nile. This, of course, will, in the next few verses, introduce us to the child Moses, the one who will eventually, with God's assistance and God's direction, lead the people to freedom, to liberation. He will lead this Exodus. And we're told of a resourceful mother who is determined to save her son. We're told that she sees that her son is good. It says good in the Hebrew, and it once again pulls us back to Genesis and the phrase which describes God's evaluation for his own creation, and God called it good. And then, like Noah building the ark, Moses' mother carefully builds a small basket, which rightly translated is also ark, just like what Noah built. And she sets her son in this ark into what was once the source of life for all of Egypt, and now is a river of death. But this child will survive these deadly waters, and for him, they will bring life anew and begin the story of the Exodus. We know the next chapter of Moses' story in another ironic twist. It is the Pharaoh's daughter who rescues the child. Moved by compassion or pity, we're really not told what. Whatever her motivation, The actions of this woman, like Shiphrah and Puah, align with God's life-giving work. This princess is not intentionally serving the Hebrew God when she rescues Moses, but she sees this baby. She hears its cries, and she is able to acknowledge this poor infant's vulnerability. Through her own humanity, she recognizes this child's humanity, his need, and she acts on it. Thus, Moses will grow up under the protection of this princess. The work of both the midwives and the princess counteract the hatred and the evil and the fear that motivate Pharaoh. Their collective work, their work together, they blur the lines that Pharaoh attempts to draw between us and them, between Hebrew and Egyptian, between domination and dominated, and between dominating and dominated. It's humanity and it's justice that is God's will for us. This is what this narrative tells us again and again. Remember, this is not Pharaoh's story. This is God's story. This is God teaching God's people about who God is and who they are in relationship to Him. They are God's people. We may fear that we are either faced with tyrants insisting that we move forward in ways that are not just, that are not life-giving, or we may just feel powerless to move ahead at all. Or we may feel like we're standing in the murky waters of the Nile with no clear water or way forward. If these two stories of defiant midwives and of Pharaoh's daughter show us anything, it is this: God does provide a way forward for us. It might not be the path that we thought we were supposed to take. And it might take courage, and it might take risk, and you may have to wait for others to join you there in the mud in order for God's will to become clear. But God's liberating work always begins in the midst of murky waters and risky endeavors. So let us claim our power calmly, with great courage and with grit. Let us join with God's insistence on justice and abundant life, a life of freedom where God joins us to direct us by day in a pillar of cloud, and by night in a pillar of fire, and in the deliverance of His Son.